Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So there's this great resource. If you're a state looking at getting broadband funds through the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, all the same thing. The big law that was passed back in November, and we're expecting funds to be coming from that. And if you're going to be looking at getting funds from that, or even if you are maybe a subgrantee or potential subgrantee, like a service provider in the state, I've got a great resource for you from the Fiber Broadband Association and the NTCA that I'd like to share with you. I'll be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So the FBA, the Fiber Broadband Association, and the NTCA have come up with something that they call the Broadband Infrastructure Playbook, and this is really a great resource. So this is something that again, those two organizations, Fiber Broadband Association and NTCA, they commissioned this and had a consultant called Cartesian put it all together. Fiber Broadband Association is an association, obviously, of fiber broadband providers, and NTCA is what they call themselves, the Rural Broadband Association. Started out with rural telephone companies, basically rural telecommunications companies now. So they have a lot of the same members, and they got together and decided they would commission this book and have it put together, again, by Cartesian. You see here, implementing Bead and other broadband deployment programs. And it's really aimed at the states or the eligible entities that will be getting money from the Bead program, the Broadband Equity Access Deployment Program, which is where the primary, or I should say that most of the funds coming from the Infrastructure Act are going to be under Bead. It's approximately $42.25 billion or something along those lines, 42 billion rounded off, right? So, and this is just an excellent resource. They did a webinar on this the other day, and then they released this playbook. And I'm going to go ahead and just page through it and tell you some things to look for. And at the end of this broadcast, I will post a link to where you can download this for yourself. So again, good information here. They have a forward where they talk a little bit about the bill and how it's going to help. You can see here in the table of contents, there's a section on state broadband offices. This is very important, that states that don't have a broadband office need to put one together pretty quickly. If you do have an office, you'll very likely need to beef that up and maybe do some additional hiring, things that you need to be doing as part of that function. How applying for Bead program funding, designing a broadband grant program, reporting, administrating the broadband grant program, all those kinds of things are in here. So again, it's a great resource. Talks about the opportunity here, $65 billion opportunity in total. There's the Bead program, 42.5 billion or so. Then you've got over 14 billion for affordable connectivity program and some other things. It all adds up to like 65 billion. There's middle mile dollars in there, about $1 billion for that. There's tribal programs. So as you scroll through this, again, there's a lot of information on that. And they talk a little bit here about, I thought this was interesting. So they talk about where broadband's going. You see where it was. So July 2016, average download speeds of 50 megabits per second, upload speeds of 17 megabits per second. And now, where we're sitting, or roughly sitting now, let's say December 2021, it was at 211 megabits per second by 80 megabits per second. So they're making the point in here that that's the way things are going. So even now, we're looking at trying to get a minimum of 100 megabits per second in some of these areas, where now the average is already over that. So you can see what they're showing projected here, where things are going to be going as far as 2028 here, when you're looking at over a gig. So good information in here. They have some information about preparing for the Bead program. So they say here, for example, state officials will soon be applying for funding through NTIA and then preparing to award subgrants to various projects. So that's how this all works. The states are going to get the money, and then they will have to subgrant that out to service providers that are going to provide the service. Yet many details are unknown. That's true. At this point, many details are unknown. The NTIA is scheduled to release key guidance in May 2022. And that's going to be in what's called a Notice of Funding Opportunity, and that's the target date is mid-May, on implementing Bead and the FCC broadband availability maps, which will be used for final awards of subgrants, should be released afterward. But states must start preparing now in advance of full details being available to ensure that they are ready to act when the time comes. So the whole focus here is, here's some things you should be thinking about and doing now. even though we don't know everything, because when the notice of funding opportunity comes out, a lot more details are going to be in there. But there's things you should be doing now, and this document goes through a lot of that. It shows how to use the playbook here. It says it's organized into 4 sections. Cover key topics state broadband offices will need to address. So again, this is really aimed at broadband officials and broadband offices. We've got state broadband office section, the Bead application, the grant program, and the grant program administration. And it mentions here the playbook will be revised once the NTIA releases its guidance for the Bead program and establishes specific application processes and subgrant criteria, which will inform future state priorities. So again, that's when the NOFO comes out, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, approximately mid-May is the target date for that. And then again, there's a section here on state broadband offices, talks about that. The objectives and missions. State broadband programs require clear objectives. You've got to know where you're going. To establish accountability, support effective governance, and build stakeholder trust. That stakeholder trust and just engaging with stakeholders is very important as far as getting yourself ready to be able to know how are we going to do this. Where is broadband needed, and who are the best people to do this. That's all very important. And it's got they've got some examples from states, some best practices. They've got some state broadband objectives from some states that they had talked to, so you can see that information here. They got some recommendations. Then they talk about resource and funding. States must rapidly identify and resolve internal capacity gaps in preparation for administering beads. That's another important thing, and there's a lot of information about that in here. Department and agency interfaces. The scale of Bead program. The Bead program requires broadband offices to establish strong interdepartmental and interagency connections for joined-up planning and support during deployment. So the message there is that your broadband office needs to be engaged with all the other offices that may have a part in this puzzle as far as deploying broadband in your state. So these would be other state offices, and they mention those, and they talk a little bit about the agency, planning support, and deployment support there. So good information there. I've got some recommendations. Interfaces with other stakeholders. Engage closely with local governments, community stakeholders, and experienced service providers. Collaboration between these groups will be critical to the success of the Bead program. And you notice here it says the Bead program application process requires each state to coordinate with local political subdivisions when preparing its initial and final proposal for use of the funds. So that is very important and was specifically mentioned by the Secretary of Commerce when she was talking about these funds going out. She said, these states really are going to have to prove that they engaged with the appropriate stakeholders in their areas. That's going to have to be part of the plan and the proposals when that gets submitted there. Again, some rationale and recommendations, so you can read through this. Again, I'll post the link. Very important aspect here is mapping. Information needs and mapping program. Reliable information sources are essential to design and manage state broadband programs and inform the Bead program grant application. The FCC Broadband Data Map will determine both the Bead program's allocation of funding to states and state distribution of funding on deployment projects. The Broadband Data Maps will provide location-level serviceability data across the country for the first time. So the maps are really going to trigger, well, first off, the maps have to be available before any deployment funds can be made available. That's important. And then that's also going to determine what the percentages are per state, because that's going to be determining what the served and unserved areas are and which areas need to be focused on, right? So that's all got to be in place. It says states may wish to supplement the FCC maps to aid in project prioritization, although the IIJA is clear that ultimately decisions must be made by reference to the FCC maps. So you have seen states now coming out, some have had them earlier than others. States are coming out with broadband maps, and that's primarily for them to try to get their arms wrapped around where their unserved and served areas are today. But that's not going to be the determining factor. It's going to be the national maps that the FCC sets up. But it is, I think it is good for the states to really try to figure out what the lay of the land looks like, and the way they can do that is by creating these maps, and they can then they can kind of start a preliminary challenge process as they put those maps out. They can hear from some of the stakeholders, some of the service providers, some of the subscribers, customers, businesses, or whatever, and get feedback on what the map says. And they can say, okay, well, we thought there was broadband in here, but apparently there's not, or we didn't think there was, but the service provider is providing service there. So that would be good to get some of that stuff out of the way. Even though that challenge process is going to have to take place with the federal maps, I think it would be good to kind of, again, get the lay of the land and figure out what you're up against. The states can use a share of their allocated $5 million in planning funds to fund data collection initiatives based on guidance to be provided by NTIA regarding how such funds may be used. So each state is going to get a minimum allocation of $100 million. That's before they determine, again, unserved and unserved areas, which is going to determine the percentage of the additional money that they'll get. But everybody gets $100 million. And then they can take 5% of that, or this $5 million, for planning funds. So each state's going to get that. Although FCC maps will be the final word in the BEAD program allocation and administration, alternative mapping sources can prepare the state to develop the 5-year action plan and aid the state in challenging FCC map service claims. So again, if they get their map in place, they do their initial challenge process, they have a really good idea who has service and who doesn't. It will help them as part of the challenge process when the maps come out. Again, some recommendations up here. You've got best practices and stakeholder communication, as they've talked to a couple of states that have done this. So that's good information. You can see here there's some good checklists on these processes. Then you've got applying for a BEAD program funding. There's a timeline in here, letter of intent, some of the things that need to be done. You can see the timeline here, and really the only date we're fairly confident in at this point is that we do expect the NOFO around May 15th. The Commerce Department has said that's their goal, that's what they're working towards. I expect them to hit that. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be in there, so we'll have to see. It's in the act that they're supposed to get it done within 6 months, which would be May 15th, but it doesn't say there's any penalty if they don't. So I'm sure they're going to want to get it right, but we'll see. It looks like May 15th is going to be the date. And then again, the maps from the FCC are really critical. We don't know when that's coming out. You see here it says data map expected late 2022 into 2023, but then published estimated BEAD dollars by state. So the FCC is working towards that. They've set some dates for getting data from service providers. They've got service providers are going to be able to start providing that in June, and they have to get all of that data in by September as far as where they are serving, what those speeds are, those kinds of things. And there will be more information about that coming out, but right now those dates are set. I did a broadcast about that a while back. I'll go ahead and post a link to that as well. So those are the two dates, but the rest of this is just kind of the process, right? So you've got NTIA NOFO, that's Notice of Funding Opportunity. Then the state needs to submit a letter of intent, like, yeah, we do want these funds, and I think you'd be crazy not to, right? I think every state's planning on doing that. Then you get your planning funds, and then assuming that you are going to do that, you say yes, then you're going to receive your planning funds and submit a 5-year plan. So that's kind of a alternate track right here. And then the additional things that have to happen is, again, the FCC data maps have to come out. And at that point, once this is done, and that's out, you can submit your initial proposal, receive your initial grant. Then you've got your challenge process. You've got let's say, publish final classification, start subgrant allocation, kind of off here on a separate track, but then you've got a challenge process and submit your final proposal and then receive your grant, all in that timeline there. We got your letter of intent, talks about that. It says the exact requirements of the letter of intent will be defined by the NOFO, but advanced planning to the extent possible is important. So again, these are just some good checklists and templates for letter of intent and some of the things that you can provide in there. Your state broadband plan, this is your letter introduction, state broadband office, state broadband plan, etc. So you'll be able to read through all this. Planning funds and the 5-year action plan, that's something else that you need to be thinking about. The BEAD program allows states to request up to $5 million. This is the planning funds I just talked about in their letter of intent. These funds are provided to aid the state broadband office in developing a 5-year action plan. So part of those planning funds can be used for that, to create your 5-year action plan. And it mentions here, there's a good checklist of what those planning funds may be spent on. Again, research and data collection, which could be your mapping process or figuring out where broadband is. There's some plan guidelines and a checklist you can look through, and some recommendations. Then you've got your initial proposal. Once the NTIA announces the estimated BEAD program funding allocation, states will be invited to submit their initial proposal using an online application developed by NTIA. Upon NTIA approval of the state's initial proposal, the state will receive at least 20% of its estimated funding allocation. So immediately, I guess off the bat, they'll get at least 20% of that. And then again, there's a good initial proposal template here with some checkboxes. Then there's the challenge process. The BEAD program mandates that states complete a challenge process to accurately identify unserved and underserved locations at least 60 days before awarding grants. So the state's going to have to have this challenge process in place so that you're going to have your stakeholders and your service providers are going to be saying, again, trying to determine which areas really are unserved and underserved. Maybe there's an area that's showing as unserved or underserved on the map, but 5G was deployed there 3 months ago, and now it's not unserved anymore. It's not underserved. So you got to get that in place. Congress is specific that the state's challenge process must be transparent, evidence-based, and expeditious, allowing any unit of local government, nonprofit organization, or other broadband service provider to submit a challenge. Here's a challenge process case study from Illinois that you can look over. Then the final proposal template. You can see again a good template and check boxes. And then designing a broadband grant program. That's the section there. It says failure to design an effective grant program risks leaving unserved communities stranded for years to come. So the grant program, that grant process is very important. The NTIA will issue additional rules on implementing Bead in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, scheduled to be released in May, which will include standards for how states assess capabilities and capacities of prospective subgrantees. So one of the things that will probably be required, for example, would be getting maybe financials from service providers, maybe technical plan if they're, especially depending on how long they've been in business. If it's a service provider like Charter, something like that, they're in business, they're technically capable, financially, you may have to get financials from them, I guess, but at least, you're going to have more information about somebody like that as opposed to maybe an entrepreneur that steps in that says they're going to do it, or even a city or an EMC that's not in the broadband business yet. They may require more, maybe more of a technical plan because it's something that's brand new to them. So the NTIA is going to have information on what you're going to be able to need to get from these prospective service providers to assess their capabilities, both technically, I would imagine, and also financially. Qualifying broadband infrastructure projects may, in order of priority, cover areas. Oh, that's right here. Sorry. So scope and eligibility standards. So it does talk about the scope and eligibility standards that are required. The program statute sets out qualifying criteria for Bead program infrastructure projects, including minimum service requirements. And it talks about broadband projects, and those would be areas that are 80% unserved households and cover areas with 80% unserved or underserved households, or connect another anchor institution like in 1 gig symmetrical. Broadband infrastructure projects may meet the Bead program deployment and service requirements, which NTIA is expected to elaborate upon in the NOFO. So again, that's information coming. There's a good checklist here. Some recommendations, case study for Maine. Project prioritization. So it talks about, in the Act, there's certain priorities that have to be done in a certain order. Talks about those. For example, you've got to do unserved areas first. Those would be less than 25 by 3. Then you can do your underserved areas. That's less than 100 by 20. And then you can do your anchor institutions. And those are supposed to be any that are less than a gigabit service for the anchor institution. There's also some requirements for the service that it meet speed, latency, reliability, consistency, and quality of service and related criteria. And again, that will all be defined by the NTIA within the NOFO. Ensures that the network built by the project can easily scale speeds over time. It mentions, to meet evolving connectivity needs, to support the deployment of 5G, maybe as a backhaul kind of thing. Then you need to have persistent, then there's other priority areas like persistent poverty, counties or high poverty areas, speeds, how fast something can be completed, demonstrate a record of plans to be compliant with FCC employment laws. So these are different things that need to be taken into account as far as priorities. And there's the low-cost option. This is still really unclear in my mind as to how this is going to play out as far as what's going to qualify for that. I think they're going to leave a lot of that up to the state. The Bead program requires that every subgrantee service provider offer a low-cost broadband service option. Some aspects are spelled out in the statute, such as a prohibition on rate regulation. Beyond this, states will need to comply with any direction provided in the NOFO. And again, a case study here with Wisconsin. Match funding. So Bead mandates a state or subgrantee minimum contribution of 25% towards each project's cost, except in high-cost areas. Then it tells you eligible sources for those matches. That could be private companies, state and local governments, nonprofits, cooperatives, utilities. regional planning or government organizations, federal regional commission authorities. So, and then also high-cost projects are exempt from that, so they will determine what is a high-cost project, and if that is a high-cost project, then there doesn't have to be a matching fund there. So. And let's see here, reporting. States should prepare for a step change in the amount of reporting that will be required. The Bead program requires states to submit semi-annual reports to the NTIA that describe the status of the program, grant-funded coverage, and uptake. Initial report and final report are also required at the start and end of the Bead program. So this is another example of why states are going to have to beef up their broadband offices, because there'll be a lot of reporting involved in this. The service providers are going to have to report everything that they're doing, and it's going to have to come back to the state, and it's all going to have to be reported back up to the NTIA. And they've got some good checklists here for state reporting, subgrantee semi-annual report checklist, that kind of thing. Talks about payments. There's no specific guidance. You can read through that. Administering the grant program. Pre-application engagement. Effective engagement will result in greater participation, higher quality applications, and better state outcomes. So you should be engaging prior to your application. Again, a checklist for that. Good case study here, workforce development case study for Louisiana. And a checklist information required from applicants. So you've got your executive summary, company information, financial information. Again, these are the kinds of things that you want to be getting from those people that are going to be applying for funds. Operational capability, technical capability. So all of these are things that I don't think have been specified yet by the NTA, but I think certainly these are things that you should be keeping in mind that you're going to have to get from these folks in order to make sure that the grant funds are going to be used appropriately and effectively. And the applicant challenge process talks about that, and another case study that's on scoring consideration, selection and contracting. So we basically get through the end here where it talks about the award and the post-award process, and that's pretty much it. So this, again, great resource. At the end of this broadcast, shortly after, I'll post a link to this. So if you are a state, for sure, check this out if you're not already available or aware of it. I think there was a webinar where the Fiber Broadband Association went through this and talked about it, but they basically did what I did, which was show it to you. So I think reading the document is maybe the way to go, but you might find that webinar as well. I'll link to the resource page where this was, and I think it might have a link to the webinar too, who knows. So I see a comment here from Lois. Indiana will move slow, if at all. AT&T bad and slow. That's interesting. I don't know. There's a lot of money here, so Indiana may be working on things in the background now that you're not even aware of. Now, AT&T is a different question, but here's the thing that's going on, Lois, is that as all of these funds are sitting out there, and people like AT&T know that this money is out there. Any areas that are slow, that are bad, let's say maybe you've only got DSL there, or for some reason there's a problem. If those areas are not up to par, AT&T wants to get them that way before this money becomes available, because they don't want anybody else to be able to come in and overbuild in that area using money from the federal government. So AT&T right now is very quickly trying to deploy fiber in areas that don't have fiber that's in their service footprint. Other service providers doing the same thing. Verizon's doing that. Some of the cable companies are upgrading their cable plant in different areas, and they're installing fiber in other areas. So people are trying to get as much broadband out there as possible. There's companies out there like T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T that are deploying 5G broadband. That would be fixed wireless broadband that they're deploying, not just mobile, but fixed wireless that you can get in your home that can get over 100 megabits per second. So a lot of them are trying to get their footprint on the map, so that when these funds become available and they start looking at the map to see what's unserved and unserved, they don't want their area to be considered unserved or underserved, because they want to make sure that they don't get competitors coming in that are being funded by the federal government. So it's bad now, but even before these funds are available, you may find out that your service gets better just because of that. So I think that's taking place all over the country right now, which is good news. And it also may mean that when these funds finally come out and people look at the map and go, you know what, there's not nearly as many unserved and underserved areas as there were at that point. And then Maybe the NTIA says, well, what can we do to bring prices down? So we have AT&T is the only provider here. There needs to be another competitor to bring prices down, and maybe they do fund somebody to come in and overbuild in that territory. We don't know. Don't know how that's going to work just yet. So thanks for joining me. Hopefully this was helpful, especially if you're state. I think it was helpful. If you haven't seen this, definitely go get it. Again, I'll post a link right after this broadcast is done. If it was helpful, give me a thumbs up if you would on the video. I always like that. And if you're not subscribed, and this is the kind of stuff that's of interest to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And make sure you click the little bell to be notified whenever I'm live or when we post a video. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.